Hello, class. This lecture will get into this concept called the Paleolithic and mostly cover our friends, the Neanderthals, and see what happened to them. Where are they? What happened to those guys? Um, right. Okay, let's do a little bit of background on the changing climate over the past few million years, I guess. Um, so this is a kind of a complicated graph here, but what is basically being indicated is the temperature. And uh, as we get closer to the present, over here on the right, the temperature has gone lower. And so what basically I just show this to remind us that for most of the past 3 million years, 2.5 million years, the planet has been in an ice age. Um, we've only just got out of the last ice age 10,000 years ago. So the baseline for the planet for the past 3 million years has been much, much, much colder than it is today. Um, our species came into existence during this ice age period, during this colder period. There's a couple of things to point out, more than just being cold. Like, 5 million years ago, 6 million years ago, the temperature was warmer than it has been for most of the past 3 million years. There's a lot more variability from one year and one decade and one century to the next. So some people have suggested that our ancestors who grew up in this kind of tumultuous environment that was maybe a bit colder and maybe a bit less predictable, that actually that sort of environmental flux could have had impact on our sort of cognitive development. It's an idea. One thing I also want to point out about the Ice Age, I think there's a lot of misconceptions, popular misconceptions about the Ice Age. In the Ice Age, uh, the whole planet wasn't covered in ice. I think there's movies like the cartoon Ice Age and all sorts of other like pop culture depictions about when people talk about the Ice Age, there's a tendency for us to envision the whole globe covered in snow. That's very wrong. Um, During the Ice Age, which we've been in for most of the past 3 million years, there's increased glaciation, meaning the glaciers are bigger. Um, New York City would have been under ice as recently as 15,000 years ago. A few thousand feet of ice, New York City would have been under. All of Canada, basically, most of Europe, not so much maybe like Italy, maybe some parts of Spain, not so much. Southeastern Europe, less. A lot of Russia, a lot of Siberia. And the glaciers that sort of form around mountains, like, the Himalayas are like covered in snow. So are the Alps, so are all the Rocky Mountains, all the big mountains are covered in snow. Those extend much further during an ice age. So, yeah, like parts of North America and parts of Europe would have been pretty uninhabitable, but down by the equator, it's perfectly fine. Like it's like pretty nice. It's not really noticeably cold. Like by the equator, you'd still be hot during these ice ages. A couple things to like point out, like um, the over the course of this past 3 million years, there has been sporadically they've had interglacials, these periods kind of like we're in right now, where it gets a little bit warmer. And these interglacials sometimes last for 10,000, 20,000, maybe 30,000 years, and they usually shift back into an ice age. That's been the pattern for most of the past 3 million years. Of course, we can talk about climate change today. Um, for all, just to remind us that we should be worried about climate change and global warming. Um, uh, Today, in the year 2024, there is more CO2 in the atmosphere than there has been throughout this past 5 million years or so. Um, for most of the past, like basically this entire chart, there's been about 250 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Today, it's getting close to about 420 parts per million. And that is a level that is very similar or close to what would have been going on during the dinosaur times, like 60 million years ago. And back then, the planet was extremely hotter, like more like a greenhouse. We could talk more about climate change if you want. Okay, so this word Paleolithic. Um, this is an archaeological term meant to describe an era. Paleo means old and lithic means stone. And it's like it's kind of fuzzy and there's some wiggle room here, but roughly about 2.5 million years ago to um uh till basically the end of the last ice age, 15,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago. Um, there's archaeologists would say that humans were living in Paleolithic cultures, and that just means old Stone Age. And so that basically is like that's like defined by the onset of the use and invention of stone tools up until um, basically not that they were still using stone tools. We'll talk about the Mesolithic and the Neolithic a little bit later, but this is just like the old Stone Age is basically what it means. And a lot of stuff was happening. Pretty much all the big stuff happens in this Paleolithic. Um, we leave Africa, we get fire, we do cave paintings, we are doing hunting, burying humans, doing like symbolic representation, developing language, probably. These are some rough like numbers I wouldn't necessarily focus on memorizing or anything like that. So yeah, we will talk more about the Mesolithic and the Neolithic in following classes, but just so you kind of have a rough idea of when these sort of years are. And again, KYA means thousands of years ago, and MYA means millions of years ago. Um, these dates and times aren't like super set in stone, and they're also relative. Like the Neolithic we'll talk about is like defined as populations and cultures that have developed agriculture and sedentary living, but that doesn't happen in the same time all around the world for all populations. It starts a little bit earlier in the Middle East. It doesn't really, then it develops a little bit later in the Americas and in Western Europe. So like the earliest you see people doing like farming, agriculture is about 10,000 years ago. But in parts of like Northwestern Europe, it doesn't happen until 5,000 years ago. So the Neolithic doesn't start everywhere at the same time. And in some cases, there are populations that, to this day do not farm. It's getting harder and harder though in the year 2024. This is just a quick little map of the movement of Homo sapiens over the past 200,000 years out of Africa. Again, I really want to reiterate that all Homo sapiens uh, did evolve in Africa. Um, Different species of Homo did develop outside of Africa. We'll talk about that in a second here. But you can see, we covered a lot of ground here as humans. We'll talk about the Americas a little bit later in the semester, but basically by about 20,000 years ago, us humans had gotten to everywhere on the planet except for Antarctica. And that seems like a hard one to ask. So we've got to every continent but Antarctica, and Antarctica is really hard. We barely got to Antarctica now. So we moved pretty fast. People did, it seems like there was a pretty big exodus of Homo sapiens out of Africa around 75 to 100,000 years ago. And in the course of that time, you made it all the way to the bottom of South America. Why do we move? Does it seem like that's kind of far-fetched to migrate all the way from Africa to South America and well, it's maybe more important, impressively, like from Africa to Australia, even in about 20,000 years or so. Um, well, I mean, if you think about it, these are nomadic populations. They don't live in one place. They don't have like permanent residences. They sort of follow the migratory patterns of, buffalo or deer or whatever. Um, and if you think about it, if you more or less move, like say you're born in Manhattan and then you die somewhere in like, I don't know, New Jersey or something like that, um, you've moved maybe 10 miles, 20 miles. But if you do that over the course of, several generations, 100 generations or so, you might very well end up in Florida or Mexico or, South America or something like that. Not even really trying, just like you might not even notice that you're migrating. Your whole family or clan might not be consciously saying, "Oh, we're migrating south." They would just sort of like, they just like ended up 20 miles or so south of where they were born or where they started. And you by over the course of several generations, you'd kind of accidentally have migrated all the way to South America. Um, some of the big innovations coming up in the Paleolithic, fire, big game hunting, definitely living structures. We'll talk a little bit more about permanent living structures. Definitely art, representation, burial of the dead. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. So back to the climate. Since there was an ice age, when there's an ice age, that means sea level is much lower because more of the planet's H2O is frozen solid. And so that means the sea levels go down. And then when it warms up, the sea levels rise because more of the planet's H2O has melted and turned into liquid water. So it makes the sea levels rise. Um, and yeah, the sea levels did have like, went back, have sort of, the sea level has risen about 500 feet from the last ice age, which means this is a kind of an interesting map. This purple regions are supposed to indicate where there would have been glacier, like ice cover. These purple regions would have been pretty uninhabitable. But where there's green, there usually is living things. And again, just because it's ice age, like it's perfectly fine, like down around equatorial Africa, North Africa. Like it's not even noticed. You wouldn't necessarily need like a jacket or something. Okay, so speaking to that sea level rise thing, this looks like a pretty normal map, but if you zoom in and look a little closer, you'll find a couple things that are weird about it. This is supposed to be like the land masses during the Ice Age. You might notice that obviously Alaska and Siberia are connected over here. Florida's kind of fatter than we usually see. South America too. Um, Great Britain is attached to the continent of Europe here. And all of like Indonesia is sort of one big mass. And the Mediterranean is closed. So Spain and North Africa would have been touching. You could have walked from there. What causes this sort of periodic changes? I mean, the planet, if you go back far enough, like if you go back like 300 million years or so, I think the planet, 350 million, the planet was really, really cold. Then there's a really warm period during the dinosaurs. And about 60 million years ago, the planet cools down a bit. It's pretty hot about 6 million years ago, but then yeah, we get this ice age that starts close to about 3 million years ago. And we've been in like a cold phase for most of the past 3 million years. If you if you were to like bet based on the past 3 million years, you might bet that we would enter an ice age again sometime in the next 10,000, 20,000 years. That is the pattern that we've been on the past 3 million years. But, you know, 3 million years is a long time, but it's only one little bit of the Earth's time. So, we go from hotter and warmer phases. If you use the past 100 million years as a guide, today is like relatively cold still. Um, so we could be entering like some of those like really extreme temperatures of heat that were happening, say, about 100 million years ago. That is possible, just as it is possible to enter an ice age again. There are a lot of reasons why the climate does enter these phases. So for the past 3 million years, it's been really pretty regular, where you'd have like this kind of nice interglacial like we're having now, and that would last maybe 10 to 30,000 years, and then it'll be ice age again for like 150,000 years. And some people have suggested that this is kind of directly related to some of the wobbles of the Earth's axis, solar activity, but also tectonic activity can cause, can bump us out of a steady state. It's all to say, um, we should be worried about what humans are doing to the climate. Um, I just want to make sure that people are worried about that. We are changing the climate. We are altering the climate patterns. Now, I know, like, in the press, we hear a lot about global warming, and it does seem as though temperatures have risen these past 150 years, and it's true. We have had the hottest years on record in the past. I mean, this is like every month is the hottest month on record globally. Um, and so we should be worried about that. Don't go and tell your friends like, oh, we don't have to worry about global warming because we should be more worried about ice ages. The lesson is that these interglacials, these kind of periods that we are enjoying right now, or we have enjoyed for the past 10,000 years, are very delicate. They're very fragile, and they can easily be knocked out of. Um, the more baseline temperature is not like this. This is an anomaly, kind of. The temperature we've enjoyed these past 10,000 years is um, abnormal. And so it's kind of delicate. It's kind of fragile. And so when we are messing around with the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, that could easily, knock us out of this nice climate that we've enjoyed the past 10,000 years. Okay, so let's talk about the Neanderthals. Neanderthals are fun. Everybody likes Neanderthals these days. What are they? Okay, so Neanderthal, where are they? They're found in a pretty wide stretch of land. It used to be that we only thought they were kind of in Europe and maybe like very West Asia, but more and more they're finding them further east. It looks like Neanderthals might have gotten almost as far east as sort of the western part of China. They seem to have lived from about 500,000 years ago to, 25, 30,000 years ago. Pretty good run. That's actually longer than Homo sapiens have been alive, if, based on our best evidence so far. Um, and so, yeah, they did evolve outside of Africa. They evolved from Homo erectus, just like we did, but the Homo erectuses that they evolved from had moved to Europe and Asia, whereas the Homo erectuses we Homo sapiens evolved from had stayed in Africa. Um, some of the stats there, they are bigger than us, like kind of chunkier, thicker. That might very well be because they grew up in colder climates. Like they grew up in Europe during these ice age times, like Spain. They're in Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Poland, some of these regions, and further west or further east, I mean. You know them by their famous brow ridges. These are actually pictures of what they're supposed to look like, which some people find it kind of interesting that they seem like they probably, based on genetics, had like red hair, kind of, or kind of orangish hair, which again, probably isn't that surprising if you think about it, considering like, even among us Homo sapiens, uh, orange-haired, blonde-haired, fair-haired people are from that part of Europe. Um, some studies of their bones and their sort of throat muscles or throat bones have suggested they might have had high-pitched voices, which again maybe comes as somewhat of a surprise. But yeah, bigger hands, bigger teeth, big brow ridge there. And yeah, a different shaped cranium and skull and a different sized brain, different shaped brain. They're definitely doing like the big game hunting. They're hunting woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and all that. They did have burials. Um, there is some like some people have suggested that they might be cannibals or there's some cannibalism. There's no more cannibalism among Neanderthals than there is among humans. I mean, sure, I wouldn't be surprised if a Neanderthal at some point in time ate another Neanderthal, but humans have been doing, Homo sapiens have been doing that too, plenty, and still do today sometimes. But yeah, they go extinct, they disappear. This species, Neanderthal, disappears off of we don't find any more bones of it in Europe or anywhere after about 25,000 years ago. And they do work their way. On this map, the purple area is supposed to be like a representation of where Neanderthals live, but um, more recent evidence, this purple part should extend a bit further east. But so the last ones that go extinct, they are found very far down here at the bottom of Spain. So if you're thinking about sort of the migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa, it went sort of this way. Like Homo sapiens appear in the Middle East, and then they start moving into Europe from the east. And so it seems like there's a real correlation between humans, Homo sapiens, I mean, showing up in Europe around 40,000 years ago, and just gradually seems as though Neanderthals' habitats just keep getting pushed and pushed and pushed further down here towards the bottom of Spain. And the last sort of remnants or holdouts of Neanderthals does appear down here. Like, so humans kind of came in here, kind of knocked them down, it looks like, one way or the other. So, right, lots of theories about why they're not here with us. Why are we here and they're not? Um, so, I mean, there's yeah, like just like the ideas about bipedalism. There's a lot of ideas, and maybe they're all a little bit true. Um, so we're definitely here and they're not, but um, there's a little bit of a caveat about to what extent they're not here. Because everybody on the planet not of direct African descent has some percentage of Neanderthal DNA in them, from like 1 to 3% of everyone without direct, not, without everyone not directly descended from Africa has some Neanderthal genetic overlap, which pretty much seals the deal that we hooked up. um, that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did have sex and had offspring, which, that was kind of a game changer. People didn't necessarily think that prior to about 20 years ago. So you could almost ask questions like, well, are they extinct? Or, does 3% of Neanderthal DNA still being in us suggests that they are kind of not quite extinct, or are we kind of a mashup between Homo sapiens? Are like if it make it makes if I hope it makes sense that populations in like directly descended from Africa do not have any Neanderthal DNA because there were no Neanderthals in Africa. But any Homo sapiens that left Africa, they did run into Neanderthals and, at least in some cases, did procreate. Um, so one thing also to keep in mind is that, yeah, it looks like we wiped them out, but we did coexist for 10,000 years or so, and maybe 20,000 in some cases further east. But definitely in Europe, even, there was coexistence from like 40,000 to 30,000 years ago. You could say in parts of uh, like, yeah, the modern day Middle East, like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, that there was coexistence for 20,000 years or so. Um, so that's like, it's not like we just got there and they were dead and then like they immediately died. So it's a little bit of a mystery still, but um, there's ideas that sometimes people suggest like, oh, maybe we killed them. Like we got in wars or fights and we won the war and the fights and we killed their body, like we just killed them and murdered them. Um, that it's possible. I'm sure in some cases there might have been conflicts when our population was meeting their population. But there's not a lot of evidence for like widespread like mass murder of Neanderthals. You don't find like usually if there's some kind of wars or battles or mass murders, that's something that actually would show up in the archaeological record pretty well. You'd find a deposit of lots of like Neanderthals killed together or something like that. But you don't see a lot of that. So most people don't believe that humans straight up killed Neanderthals, like murdered them. There's other ideas about just sort of generally outcompeting Neanderthal groups for resources. This seems pretty believable, sort of like it's not like we tried to kill them, it's just that we were maybe consuming resources that maybe they needed to, like we were killing the woolly mammoths instead of them. Um, and gradually they just sort of got pushed to the brink or pushed outside. Some people have suggested that we might have brought in some kind of diseases. Like certainly, as we know, like when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they wiped out, nearly 50 million or so because of bringing contagious diseases that they had not developed any immunity to in the Americas. That's possible, of course, always possible, but a lot of those sort of diseases that we think of when we think of like European colonizers bringing them, there weren't a lot of those sort of really infectious diseases um, because no one was an agriculturalist yet, really. A lot of those big diseases foment in sedentary populations who are doing agriculture and living in close proximity to animals. And there wasn't a lot of that prior to, um, there wasn't a lot of that going on when the humans were entering into Europe. So it's possible there's some kind of disease, but it wouldn't be a similar, it would not be the same sort of situation as what happened when the Europeans arrived in the Americas and wiped out so many. Um, so yeah, as it says here, there's pretty conclusive evidence that humans and Neanderthals hooked up. What were these relationships like? I mean, you don't know. We can't really tell. I mean, as you know, this is not pleasant to talk about, and it's kind of uncomfortable. But you sometimes in situations their procreation is not voluntary, so it's entirely possible that it was not an amicable like meeting, but um, and oftentimes if there's an invading population, there is instances of rape, and sometimes that can lead to sort of these that could be an explanation for why we have some Neanderthal DNA in us. There's no reason to necessarily believe that, though. Um, there's no more, it's not more or less likely that when humans met Neanderthals, it was an amicable or a hostile interaction. I'm sure the thing is, I'm sure it was different every time. Like it happened multiple times. It's not like there was just one day in a field where all humans met all Neanderthals. There was probably several different human tribes and groups and clans that met several different clans of tribes of Neanderthals as well. So maybe some were cool and chill, maybe some were got in fights. I'm sure actually all of the spectrum of things happened. But okay, so some people do, ask like, why did they fade out? Some of the things that some people have suggested, we did domesticate dogs pretty early, but probably not that early. And I don't really know if that would have much of an impact anyway. Some people have suggested that we had some kind of counting or calendar systems. That would be evidence of like, some kind of interesting standardized timekeeping, but it doesn't necessarily maybe explain. I mean, it would be evidence that we were smart, but it doesn't necessarily explain why the Neanderthals might have disappeared. Usually people have argued that we did have more complex stone tools, but people are actually challenging that these days. We had like pretty clear evidence of abstract representation, ornamentation. We're wearing jewelry, we're engaging in long distance trade, um, doing decorative arts. And some people have suggested that that's an indication that maybe we were smarter or something like that because we were producing artworks, producing like statues and like little like portable statue things, statuettes maybe. And some people have suggested that was evidence of like maybe stronger group cohesion or group strength because we um you know were engaged in these kinds of abstract representation. But there's really not a lot of reason to believe that. And actually more and more we're finding that Neanderthals were engaging in, they buried their dead ceremoniously. They also had some kinds of artwork. We'll have a look at that in a second. Kind of the explanation that I like the most for why um, humans, Homo sapiens exist and Neanderthals do not, is this idea of basically purely numbers. Like we had more, there was more of us. Um, we weren't particularly smarter, is my thinking. Some people might disagree, but it seems as though we had very, very similar cognitive capacities. At least we're doing very similar things. Um, there was just more Homo sapiens than there were Neanderthals. They operated in much smaller clans and tribes, it appears. Like whereas they might have had like a group of like 50 people, Homo sapiens were moving around in groups of 300 or so. And so it was just like almost a kind of slow, gradual incorporation or disintegration of Neanderthals is we just kind of grew and they diminished. Um, in addition to that, having more people and like breeding more and all that, um, having more people is also very helpful if you're encountering new situations and trouble and like you need an innovation or some kind of technological, yeah, innovation, I guess. Of course, it's always more helpful if you can draw on the skills and the intelligence of 1,000 people than if you can just 100 people. So having more people like, expands your pool of, contributors and thinkers and helpers. So some people have suggested that it wasn't that any one individual human on average was smarter than any one individual Neanderthal on average. It's just that we had more people thinking and contributing. I mean, it's not a like perfectly satisfying answer, but it seems one way or another. Again, like there was probably different interactions. Maybe sometimes people were hostile, maybe sometimes people were nice, but it almost seems like just by pure numbers, it was going to happen that they would eventually be sort of out competed or out sort of their populations would continue to diminish. These are some of the stone tools. Again, it's sort of been suggested that these kind of more detailed tools that are being made by Homo sapiens and some of these ones, that these were not made by Neanderthals, but more recently, it does appear that Neanderthals were making more complex stone tools than we had originally thought. Um, right, some more pictures of stone tools. Again, it was a weird thing for most of the past 100 years when archaeologists would find stone tools that were really complex. They would just say, oh, these are made by humans because Neanderthals can't make these. But and even if some stone tools that were like of the complex Homo sapien variety were found in context next to a Neanderthal, even then archaeologists would be pretty dismissive and they would say, well, maybe they got these from Homo sapiens, or maybe they learned how to make them from watching Homo sapiens make them, but there's no way they could have invented them themselves. They had to sort of see the Homo sapiens make them and then they could mimic the Homo sapiens. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, okay, that's entirely possible. But I think it's a little bit presumptive to suggest that usually a lot of people interpret Neanderthal cognitive skills as like very similar to ours, but less inventive, um, less creative. That's often something that's associated with them, but there's really no reason to believe that. That's just pure speculation. Some people have speculated some of this stuff that like Neanderthals might not have had humor or that they were kind of antisocial or had something like ADD or something like autism or something maybe, or that they would have maybe appeared to us to have something like autism. Well, I mean, these are just speculations. It's interesting to think that this might have been the case and that we were a little bit more socially evolved or something like that, but there's no evidence for it whatsoever. People used to really debate if Neanderthals had language at all. Again, there's no conclusive evidence one way or the other, but if I had to guess, again, I don't have access to any like, definitive answers, but for me, it seems highly likely that they had language. If they're doing art, they're, engaged in sort of symbolic representation and jewelry stuff and doing this big game hunting, I think they were probably communicating in something pretty similar to what we call language. So I'm not a big fan of some of these sort of comparative, sort of reductive ideas of Neanderthal capabilities or capacities or abilities. Okay, so art. Neanderthals did have art, and this is all pretty new stuff. These are some like fairly recent discoveries. So again, for most of the past 100 years of archaeology, one big thing that we thought was cool about us, Homo sapiens, was that we were making cave art and cave drawings, and Neanderthals weren't doing stuff like that. But so this is a drawing that has, based on our best evidence, looks like it was drawn by Neanderthals from about 60,000 years ago in Spain. And so, I mean, there wasn't Homo sapiens in Spain 60,000 years ago. So if indeed everything is correct and everything checks out, and this is from 60,000 years ago, it must have been made by a Neanderthal. I don't know what's going on in this drawing. It's hard to, to tell. It's really abstract. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't look like anything really. I mean, you can kind of see some kind of, bison or deer or something down here, and maybe another little bit of an animal, and maybe something sitting down here, and some kind of weird abstract shape. Um, but it's something. It's using, it's drawing, it's creating. It's not for us to say it's bad art. I mean, there's plenty of contemporary art being made today that looks, just as abstract. And yes, they are burying their dead with grave goods, which has always been seen as a very significant uh, bit of abstract thought. Uh, we think that grave goods, burying people with goods, is seen as significant because it indicates some kind of ideas about maybe an afterlife or maybe something that happens after you're dead, or just some kind of, very symbolic gesture of, memory or gratitude. Um, and it's a non-functional practice. If you bury someone with a sword, that means that's one sword you don't have. Or if you bury them with like beads, those are just beads that you could otherwise have, but you're going to bury them with the dead, and so no living person can ever use them. Um, they were also, it seems like they were making like high heats, maybe some like early sort of proto pottery type, like heating clay. Um, and so, well, with all this talk about genetics and sort of equal intelligence or similar intelligence, it is true. People are starting to ask the question, should we even think of Neanderthals as a a separate species? Could we think of them as maybe just what we've been calling Homo neanderthalis, thalis? Could we just instead like could we just extend what we had previously thought Homo sapiens were? Maybe this is just, maybe Homo sapiens is a bigger species. You know, it, what makes one, where we draw a line between species is ultimately kind of arbitrary. I mean, it's based on features like morphological features like, height and brain size and teeth and it's all that stuff. Like all that contributes to what we decide as a species or not. But um, Uh, I mean, one of the things that, at least when I was in school, when I was like a younger person, I think when like I was in a biology class, they taught us that like, how there's donkeys and horses, right? And sometimes they can breed, and the offspring of a donkey and horse is called a mule, right? I think. And the idea is that yeah, donkeys and horses can breed, but then mules are sterile. Like mules can't breed, is what I was always told. I haven't looked this up or anything. I could be wrong about that, but I remember something like that from my biology class. Um, and so it does appear in one way or another. So certainly it seems like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens bred, they had sex, and they have produced offspring. And if there is still some of that, Neanderthal DNA in us, it appears pretty evident that the offspring of the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals could probably breed too to some extent. So, I mean, if you really wanted to, I would be open to the argument that Neanderthals are not extinct or that Neanderthals are just a kind of distant variation on whatever Homo sapiens are. Um, so, right, from sort of the discovery of the Neanderthal bones the first time, like in the 1850s, there's always been this sort of mockery or disrespect or denigration of Neanderthals and their skills. Like we've always perceived them in pop culture and stuff as like a kind of a dumb, clumsy brute, as opposed to us Homo sapiens as like civilized and smarter and cunning and crafty and more intelligent. That whole narrative is really kind of indicative of like the colonial mindset that was popular in the 1800s. Europeans are finding these Neanderthals in Germany. And, in many cases, the dialogues around thinking about what Neanderthals were is very similar to thinking about that colonial colonizers were saying about indigenous populations around the world. Like, just less evolved than us Europeans, like not as sophisticated as us Europeans. And so there's an interesting critique here about how the Neanderthal was used as yet another kind of prop or justification or legitimization of like European supremacy by Europeans, like Europeans like thinking so highly of themselves. Like they were telling themselves this story, like, oh, wow, how cool. There was another species of primate, kind of like us, but we Europeans, we were outsmarted them and we rose to the top. That's kind of what Europeans have been telling themselves for like the past 200, 300 years, is a story of how they're better than everybody else. Um, so that's one of the reasons for why maybe the Neanderthal has gotten a bad name in the past few years. Um, Another thing to keep in mind is that, right, so here we are in the year 2024, and we think there's two species, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And here we are kind of speculating about what it was like when they met. How cool would that be? Like to run into another kind of human. Like all of us humans today on the planet are the same species. What if there was a different kind of human? Like there's different kinds of birds and, different kinds of turtles and, different kinds of felines and stuff like that. Um, what would it be to run? What would it be like for you to see another different kind of human in action? Well, that's an interesting question, and it sounds fun for us to think about. But honestly, it probably wouldn't have been that big a deal for them because it's not like they were going around calling themselves Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. They didn't have any idea of what species were. They probably just encountered another group or another clan and were like, hey, what's up? I mean, sometimes you do run into other groups of people. Sometimes it's a very cordial interaction, and sometimes it's a hostile interaction. But it probably wouldn't have been like some kind of shocking thing for those Homo sapiens that are leaving Africa, going through the Middle East, and then going into Europe. It wouldn't have been like some crazy thing for them to run into another group of similar, just another clan, another culture, another tribe. And they wouldn't have necessarily even, it wouldn't have even been a thought in their mind that this was a different species because there wasn't, the concept of species didn't exist. And if, they're hanging out and if they are in a peaceful sort of relationship and there's sort of sometimes interbreeding between their groups or their cultures, like it wouldn't have been like, no one would have been like grossed out by it. No one would have said, oh, gross, you had sex with a Neanderthal. That just would not have been a concept. That's something that we might think of to like retroject onto them, but that's not something that probably would have been thought about by those populations. Um, Another like interesting thing about Neanderthals that I'll just mention real quick. We have totally reconstructed the entire Neanderthal genome, like the entire like DNA sequence of the Neanderthal we have. And if you're familiar with Jurassic Park, and there's the whole concept of Jurassic Park is that we have the DNA of a dinosaur, and so we can reconstruct a dinosaur in a laboratory and then sort of have them bred. And obviously, Jurassic Park is kind of sort of meant to say, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. It's something will go wrong. Shouldn't mess with nature like that. But it certainly is an idea that has been floated by some kind of bold, crazy people. Same with the woolly mammoth. We could artificially inseminate like a living elephant with a fetus of a woolly mammoth and have it give birth to a woolly mammoth. It seems like we're pretty close to having the genetic technology to do that, or at least experimenting on it. We haven't done it yet, thank goodness. And so by the same token, we could do that with Neanderthals, if not right now, but like pretty soon. The idea would be you would probably inseminate a Homo sapien woman with a Neanderthal fetus. I'm not a big fan of this. Not to sound like a prude or scared of progress or something like that, but you know, it's not because I don't like Neanderthals. Hey, it'd be cool if there was Neanderthals, but it just seems like it opens up such a can of worms of unknowns. And would these, if we were to like sort of breed Neanderthals or even woolly mammoths or any extinct species, it just seems like Not, I mean, it does, maybe it does sound a little Jurassic Parky, but like, you know, species go, I mean, sometimes like in the past 200 years, Homo sapiens have caused so many species to go extinct. Um, Passenger pigeon, the dodo bird, of course, famously, and any number of species we can't even see and can't even tell that they've gone extinct. And we should feel pretty guilty about that. Because that's like just out of pure kind of recklessness. Um, but species like the woolly mammoth, which we did interact with and we did hunt a lot, and species like the Neanderthal, um, I'm a little bit hesitant to sort of suggest that we need to have these things living with us today. And think about them. Think about how like the Neanderthal with its full range of feelings, which is probably similar to ours. Like, say we bring a Neanderthal to life or something, um, what are they gonna be thinking? Are they gonna think they won't think of themselves as a Neanderthal, but we're gonna tell them that, hey, you're some crazy experiment that we brought you back, you're an extinct species we brought back to life. It's gonna be very hard to communicate with them, but um well, yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, it'd be a real hell of an experiment to sort of raise a Neanderthal and to see how human it was. I appreciate the interest. Like, wow, we could really learn a lot, but it just seems like a bad idea to me. But I could be wrong. Okay, that's it for this one here.